Well,
Hello
good
there,
evening,
sir.
ladies and gentlemen. Folks out there in the audience, I'd like you all to at least mentally offer Ron a happy birthday. Today is, in fact, the man's birthday. So, how old are you today, sir?
I am 54 years old today.
Ah,
Fif-
you're like a babe in swaddling clothes.
Well, you know what? Yeah, whenever I remember as a kid thinking, "Oh my goodness, that is ancient." And to tell you the truth, the check engine light does come on from time to time, but for the most part, I'm okay.
Mine is permanently on, as well as the refill the oil and
That's right.
change my
That's right.
windshield wipers 24/7 these days. So.
That's right. That's right. Hey, and what better way to celebrate this than with you and these great listeners? And also, because I have Irish heritage, although, I took the DNA test and I only have like 26% Irish heritage, but enough to say, that's still pretty close, a third of it, whatever. But yeah, what better way than to spend it here with you guys?
And you know what? I've never actually taken a DNA test, but the my last name, of course, is Italian, so people tend to think of me in a Mediterranean way. But my other half of my family are the McClures
Oh, right.
of Scotland. We're from a region, sort of a kingdom in Scotland. They called Dalriada, and it extended from the west coast of Scotland and then down into the northeastern coast of Ireland, County Antrim, which is where a lot of my family lived after they left Scotland. So it seems like we've both got a fair dose of the Emerald Isle in our blood.
Absolutely. And did you know that the word SCOTUS, SCOTUS, at one time referred to people from Ireland?
No, I did not. Actually,
That,
that's
that's a
interesting.
true story. Yeah. Well, the Celts, that's one of the things that's going to be interesting because we talk a lot about connecting the dots and how, things, certain archetypes are influenced by different, civilizations and such. The Celtics were so far spread that a lot of these ideas, I think that we could trace back to, Indo-European developments, but that's something to talk about as we go on.
Yeah, absolutely. So, of course, ladies and gentlemen, thank you as always for joining us on Mysteries, Myths, and Monsters. And we do have a really fun show. Of course, I'm sure all of you realize that over the last couple of days we've had two very, very special events. One of them at 5:24 p.m. Eastern Time today. It officially was the first of spring. So today is the vernal equinox with a day and a night of equal length. And from here on out, the days are longer than the nights, and we'll have sunny days and flowers of bloom. And so I'm sure a lot of us are very much looking forward to that. And of course, just this past weekend was also St. Patrick's Day. And depending on where you live, that might have meant that you had green beer to drink, a parade, and wore all your favorite emerald colors to work. And so it has been a very, very green last few days for most of us.
Absolutely, yeah. I've never went into St. Patrick's Day very much, and of course, I'm a cradle Catholic, so even I've never even attended a St. Patrick's church around here, as a matter of fact. But yeah, we'll be talking about all that great stuff. And
Um,
I've never owned a shillelagh either.
no, I've never owned a shillelagh myself, although a couple of times I've wanted one to whack someone over the head when they needed it. But
That's right. That's
uh,
right. Yeah.
just up the road from where I grew up in Newport, Rhode Island, is a little town called Bristol, and Bristol had the oldest St. Patrick's Day in the nation. And until COVID struck and they had to postpone a couple of years, it was actually the oldest, longest running St. Patrick's Day in the country, which I think was very cool. And certainly we went to those many times over the years, and so not a bad deal. But
That's absolutely the case. Yeah.
yeah, but so it's interesting, Sarah. Let's see, being a part of an island culture, it's interesting to see the variation of cultures develop. Yes, very, very much so. And we're actually going to talk about some of the cross-cultural aspects of Celtic belief and Celtic mythology tonight. We're going to have a lot of stuff that does focus on Ireland this evening, but in dealing with the Celtic cultures, we're not just dealing with Ireland. We're dealing with the British Isles in general, and even spilling onto the sort of the continental Europe. The Celts were spread pretty far and wide. But I think it's interesting. We talk about St. Patrick, all the St. Patrick's churches and everything, and how many people really have any idea who St. Patrick is, or was rather. And I say honestly, I feel like very few people do. And before a few years ago, I really wouldn't have known too much about who he was either. But I think that one of the most interesting aspects of St. Patrick's story is that St. Patrick was very much not Irish. Patrick was actually from a Romanized family in Britain, which we would call England today. But he was actually kidnapped by raiders around. This was in the mid 400s or so, so only about 430, 40 years after the birth of Christ, kidnapped by Irish raiders and taken to Ireland, where he was a slave for 6 years. And at that time, according to as far as we understand, he was himself not yet Christian. This was a period of time when Ireland and the British Isles in general were sort of slowly transitioning to Christianity, but the Emperor Constantine's official declaration that Christianity would be the official religion of the Roman Empire really had only happened about a century earlier. And as you can imagine, England and the British Isles in general, or Britain and the Great British Isles in general, being fairly remote, Christianity took quite a while to soak in there, and so that young enslaved Patricius, or Patricus, as he would have been called, I think at the time, was not in fact Christian, nor was he Irish.
That's right. The interesting thing to note, though, is that the great figure of Constantine, he actually, with the Edict of Milan in 313, he only legalized Christianity. It wasn't until we get to Theodosius the Great that Christianity became the legal religion or the only official religion. And that was in about 380. So we're talking about a generation now, a little over a generation. So Patrick was one of these people that was influenced by so many different things. One of our listeners said about the idea of an island. Great Britain also was an island, and we also have all these kind of cultures, because this is also a very Roman culture as well too. So we have an influx of all these different belief systems feeding into this one particular person.
Indeed, and so here's Patricius over in Ireland as a slave, and enslaved to people who, in many ways, I think he would have considered, if not his countrymen, at least his cousins, because the Irish and the Britons at that time were close enough that they had a lot of dealings with one another. Lots of tribal infighting at that time. But one night he had a dream, and in that dream he saw a ship carrying him away, and that gave him the courage to escape from his master. So he fled to the coast. He was actually being pursued. He actually was recaptured briefly, but eventually made it to a ship and actually made his way back to Britain and to his own family. But sometime during his return to Britain, he did convert to Christianity. Maybe he had a bad taste in his mouth because of his time with the Irish. I can't say for sure. But he did eventually choose to return to Ireland, to the people who had enslaved him, and he came back as a Christian missionary. And of course, today we tend to associate St. Patrick with the shamrock. And here's a bit of fun cross-pollination. People frequently draw a four-leaf clover in celebration of St. Patrick's Day, but that's actually not the symbol of the shamrock. The shamrock is a three-leafed clover specifically. Apparently, the shamrock itself, I'm not sure the origin of the word. Maybe I should have looked that up. But the shamrock itself doesn't technically exist. It's a variety of different clovers, any of which can have three leaves. But they say, and this is a little apocryphal, that Patrick would use the three-leafed clover to demonstrate the Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, in terms of his attempts to convert the people of Ireland, the pagan Ireland, into Christianity. And so that has become his sort of enduring symbol.
Yeah, and that probably is apocryphal, but what it does illustrate is it shows what kind of people the Irish were. They were very in tune to the world around them. They were very nature-based. And of course, when we talk about paganism, that is essentially a nature-based religion. So yeah, we're starting to get a little bit of glimmer, even though a lot of this stuff might be, pious legends. We're starting to see a little bit of glimmer of the truth if we start reading between the lines.
Absolutely. And it's certainly worth noting that Patrick was not the first, nor would he be the last Christian missionary, to attempt to convert people in Ireland. As I say, at this point, the sort of acceptance of Christianity, the eventual legalization of Christianity as the religion of the Roman Empire, had begun already to seep into even the British Isles. And while it may have been a slow conversion, Patrick was only one of many. And so how exactly he sort of achieved the status of the patron saint of Ireland after eventually being canonized, which was not for hundreds of years later, I should point out. I can't say for sure, but the legend of Patrick has grown tremendously, and I don't want to offend anyone who's a fan of St. Patrick, but I would say it has probably grown bigger than the man himself. In fact, his mission to Christianize pagan Ireland was symbolically referred to as driving the snakes from the land. And of course, most of us know that St. Patrick allegedly drove the snakes from Ireland. But the irony, of course, is that all naturalists know that there were never any snakes in Ireland, between the Irish Sea being much too cold for them to have in any way made the crossing over there. Unless snakes accidentally came across on a ship, which wasn't terribly likely, there were never any snakes in Ireland at all. And so most people accept today that it was a metaphor for driving out paganism and sort of the wickedness of the people. Of course, snakes in the Christian religion frequently associated with evil and the devil, but people still to this day interpret the legend literally, and to give fair fair time to both sides of the argument, Christian people often interpret it literally as if he drove sort of the snakes and devil himself out of Ireland, and pagan people today often say that the snakes were a symbol specifically of the Druids, who would wear a snake tattoo, and the snake was a symbol of wisdom. Both of these are largely apocryphal and are aspects of the legend that are added later on. And by the time Patrick arrived in Britain, the Druids had really been largely gone for quite some time. There was at least no Druid power. There may have been some lingering, sort of elements of the sort of presence of Druids there, but Druids did not rule Ireland at the time that Patrick was there evangelizing.
That's right. Very, very well said. Because I think that makes it even kind of more remarkable, because he was dealing with a lot of these warlords that were vying for position and everything else with among other tribes. And I think it would be much more difficult to evangelize to these people, because there was no organized unity to these people, right? It was just a free-for-all over there.
I honestly believe that if the Druids had still been fully in power in Ireland, evangelizing would have been virtually impossible, because, no offense to anyone who practices Druidism to this day, the Druids were not opposed to sacrifice. And sacrifice was often, the people who were sacrificed by the Druids were often people who were either enemies of the people or were criminals, and things like that. And so sort of an invading, evangelizing person trying to destroy or tear down their religion would have been a pretty likely choice for a sacrifice. So I'd say Patrick is probably quite lucky that the Druids were no longer in power in Ireland when he was there.
That's right. Sarah has a question for us, which is a good question. Why did Christian culture take over so well over the native cultures of those areas?
I think it's fair to say that it was a very slow process, and that part of it was osmosis. The Christians found, and we're going to directly address this a little bit later, as we go through some of these topics. But when they couldn't suppress certain aspects of the religion, they would adopt it instead. And we are going to specifically talk about a couple of Christian or a couple of pagan figures who ended up being adopted or transitioned by Christianity, so that the pagan peoples of Ireland could still sort of revere them in some form or another within the Christian religion to make it easier for them. So if they couldn't stamp it out, they adopted it. But that was not the sort of thing that happened, on a Tuesday afternoon. I mean, this is something that happened over the course of generations and even centuries.
And the world was changing very quickly as well. And it was probably better for you if you would convert, simply to keep up with the Joneses. If you're going to have any kind of a footing in this world, it's better so you get along with everybody else as well too. They probably knew within a couple of 100 years that the world was changing very, very drastically, and the old ways would probably be no more eventually. But also, as you said, the idea of synchronization of the Catholic religion with the Irish religion, with the Celtic religion in the area, it went along so well together. It fitted pretty. It was a perfect storm for this to happen at this time.
And Catholicism has always been a very magical faith.
Right.
It's of all the Christian faiths, it's one of the ones that has the most high ritual. It has, incenses and elaborate robes and things like that, all of which would have at least felt in some way familiar, to sort of the pagan Celts in Ireland, Britain, Scotland, and elsewhere. So it wasn't terribly unfamiliar to them. And even images like Jesus with his crown of thorns, on the tree. Trees were sacred to them. Thorns gods. They had death symbolism and gods that rose from the dead and things like that. So a lot of it did bear similarity, and most of the Christian missionaries, people like Patrick, would have already been raised in a pagan world and already understood that. So they had the ability to sort of sell this as not such a big changeover, and it was a fairly easy way to gently roll these people into into their faith. But it's worth noting that the first targets of conversion were almost always the wealthy and the powerful, and that was because that was where you needed to convert the powerful, because if you're out there converting the average Joe and the powerful gets wind of it and they're not on board, they're going to crush you. They're going to either imprison you or something else. So if you can convert the kings, convert the princes, convert the warlords first, then the people can come later. And it's an interesting note that we tend to refer to, again, we were constantly referring to these people as pagans, paganus, which means the folk of the country. It literally means the country dwellers. And the other common word that you hear all the time is heathen, and that's self-evident. It's the people of the heath. These were the people who lived in the rural communities, the people who were still the farmers. They were the simple country folk who held on to these beliefs for the longest. And the words for these things, paganus and heathen, ended up becoming the default word for people who still followed the old faiths.
Another good point is if you convert the warlords, they then will take it upon themselves to force their followers into their religion.
And they bring an army with them, which is not such a bad thing when you need to strong arm people a wee bit. So
that's right.
And strong arming, by the way, is certainly not out of the purview of many of these missionaries. In fact, one of my favorite stories about St. Patrick, and I have to say that this is a story that has been attributed to other monks and missionaries as well, but it's often referred to as specifically about St. Patrick. And it was that Patrick was out proselytizing, and he came through a village, and he gathered the people together in the village square, and he began to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ to them. But the people of the village were having none of it. And so in order to drown him out, every time he would open his mouth, they would howl in response to him. And eventually the entire village surrounded him, howling at him. And Patrick was so incensed and offended by this display of sort of barbarism that he cursed them, so that the people of the village all became wolves. And this story, I believe it's often referred to as the werewolves of Ossory, is a long-standing story, and one of the ways that we talk often about werewolves, of course, as we did last week, in fact, and a great werewolf story that actually is connected to St. Patrick. So St. Patrick and the werewolves is a legend that I've been hearing for years and always absolutely been delighted by. Of course, not the kindest thing to do, to turn a bunch of your alleged your hopeful flock into werewolves, but apparently Patrick thought that was a just enough reward for being rude. So be rude, be turned into a werewolf. That apparently was his solution.
And a great name for a punk band, St. Patrick and the Werewolves.
Actually, it really is. You know what? I think if we ever shut down this channel, that should be our next venture. So we've talked a lot about the Christianization efforts in Ireland, but of course the topic of our evening is not about converting Ireland and the Celtic lands to Christianity. It's about the old magic and the old ways that existed there before that time. And so that's really is our big question tonight: is what was the Celtic world like before the rise of Christianity? What were their beliefs? What were these people like? Excuse me. And so that's really going to be the topic today. And I think one thing that we all tend to do is we tend to think of, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, we tend to think of the Celtic world as being Ireland, Scotland, and to a lesser degree, England. Those are the people that we think of as dressing in, wolf skins and painting their faces with blue woad and running into battle naked and everything, which, by the way, sounds an awful lot like Vikings, doesn't it? And there's probably some commonality there. We're going to talk about that a little later today. But the truth is that the Celts, or the Keltoi, spread through most of Western Europe, Middle Europe, Eastern Europe, and even into the Near East. And in fact, most likely actually originated as an Indo sort of European people who eventually moved into and colonized Europe. So it didn't start out as the bright red-haired, lasses and lads of Ireland, but actually started out much farther to the east in Europe. And those lands were really quite extensive. So if you look here on this map, you can see not only most of Ireland and Britain, but also throughout Gaul, Spain, Spain, which is where the Gaelic language comes from. Spain across northern Italy, all the way up through down through Greece, and in fact, they spread it even as far into Turkey. So they were a very, very widespread, people, and not just one people by any means. In fact, the Irish or the Celtic tribes were very, very diverse and constantly at war with one another. The different tribes largely spoke the same language, and they did have a lot of commonalities of belief, but they fought easily as much amongst themselves as they ever did with other enemies from for other cultures. So the Celts themselves tended to be a pretty warlike people.
If people of our listeners are interested in looking at what it was like with the first century Celts in relation to conversion to Christianity, I would say look to Paul's letter to the Galatians, because this was the Celts he was writing to. It was the Celts, the Gauls, and we can see how they were having some difficulties with different parts of this Christianity. They were still holding on very strongly to their very liberal sexual attitudes that Paul was trying to get them a little bit more back onto the straight and narrow. But it's an interesting thing to look at, because I know one of the listeners talked about that. But they were having a bit of a difficult time converting over to Christianity fully. And we can see this in the letter of Paul to the Galatians.
There was a wild spirit that was very, very much a part of sort of Celtic culture and the Celtic, sort of the Celtic worldview. And so you're right. And I think we tend to imagine, because when we think of the Celts, we think of Ireland and we think of England and Scotland and things like that. I think because of that, we tend to forget just how far back the Celts, the Keltoi, really go. One of the first people to write about them and to explain who the Celts were was Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great ran across the Celts in 335 BCE, before Common Era, which is how we refer to before Christ now. But he had encounters with the Keltoi, and he referred to them as fearless warriors. And he noted specifically something that astoundingly carried forth for close to 1,000 years, is that they wore these thick golden neck rings, which we today refer to as a torque, these sort of open-ended neck rings. But it was a part of the Celtic culture even that far back. So literally more than 3 centuries before the birth of Jesus, the Celts were already known as fierce warriors, already many, many different sort of tribal factions of them. And, even encountering, the great Macedonian warrior Alexander the Great. So it's an extraordinary legacy and a depth of time that these people have existed, especially considering how much of the Celtic culture still lives today. That's got to be one of the most long-lasting cultures in human history, maybe because they were so diverse and so widespread.
Yeah. And, we talk about things like very ancient monuments. Newgrange in Ireland, the tumulus, is actually older than the Great Pyramids. So we are talking about a culture here that was also a very science-oriented culture. It wasn't just like what you would see in Braveheart. Let's put it that way. It was much more nuanced than that.
There are burial mounds and chambers, in the British Isles that go back long even before the Celts arrived, to the Proto-Celtic people, and so again, these are very, very ancient peoples, ancient lands, and a lot of traditions that astounding to think that how much of that tradition has carried forth or survived in one form or another to this day. Right. Another quite early reference to the Celts actually goes back to the 9th century. So now we're going forward in history, almost 1400 years here, but the Liber Armagh and other monastic texts from around that time, the 9th and the 10th century, offer some of the earliest written accounts of who the Celts were, of the Celtic gods, and of their traditions. But what's interesting about these texts that came from that time is that these are written by Christian monks, and so they are highly Christianized perspectives, not necessarily hostile towards who the Celts were, but viewing them through a Christian cosmology, and so often referring to the Celtic gods as not knowing if they're angelic or demonic and things like that, which were concepts which would have been completely foreign to the Celtic people themselves. But one of the reasons that the Celts themselves don't have surviving texts that have their legends or anything in them is the Celts didn't write things down. The people who of the Celts who were the great sort of legend keepers and lore keepers would have been the Druids. And we were talking about the Druids earlier, but they were the leadership, the priesthood, they were the lawgivers, they were the lore keepers of the Celtic people. But because I assume that this is a choice based on the sacredness of their traditions, they never wrote down these sort of texts. They had simple writing, which they called ogam, which was basically a variety of different slashes, often marked on trees. This was for communicating simple information, but large texts and books were not a part of their culture. The Druids memorized everything, and part of becoming a Druid was memorizing the rites, memorizing the lore, the myths, and everything of the people. But it means when the Druids died out, largely that information died out with them, or at least was only remembered in a much more fragmentary way. And so when these Christian monks came along and they were transcribing this information, it was from verbal accounts and tradition, and so by default, again, kind of fractured and not 100% complete. So we really have had to piece together a great deal of what we do know about the Celts and their religion.
And their reputation preceded them as well too.
Mm-hmm.
And we are dealing with accounts from the Romans, and we're dealing with accounts from people that basically went in there and were the victors over these subjugated people. So we really don't have a very clear picture of what was going on.
No, almost all of it has been reconstruction. And there's been some good, sort of sources where we're able to compare texts from different people over different periods of time and get a little bit of information, but almost all of it is reconstructed. And you do get a lot of sort of myth and fanciful information that bleeds into some of these reconstructions. One of the most notable of these would be, of course, Merlin. The Arthurian figure of Merlin is almost always referred to as a Druid. And of course, so Druids hold a mysterious place in mythology, almost always associated with magic and mysticism, which was definitely a part of the Druid way, but they were much more, as I say, they were the clergy of the Celtic people. So they were the ones who performed marriage rites, death services, sacrifices when necessary. They were the your direct line of communication to the gods, but also judges, oath keepers, and things like that. So they really were they were very, very highly revered. A Druid could stride in between two warring tribes and stop them with a gesture of his hand, because no Celt, in his right mind would ever disobey the word of a Druid. Certainly would not, raise a hand to them.
They were the only people that were able to harvest mistletoe. We do know that as well too, and they were the conduits between two worlds. They were also sort of shamans of the world.
Very
as well
much so.
Too. Yeah, so very interesting people. Very interesting, but. Again, they also are getting credit where credit is not due, because people had said they built Stonehenge, which preceded the Druids by thousands of years. But yes, but for the most part, I mean, for what we know from an academic point of view, it was a very interesting society that was at least brought together in theory by the Druids.
And someone who had a great deal of respect for the Druids and was fascinated by them and their culture was Julius Caesar. Of course, we just recently passed the Ides of March, and so which didn't end terribly well for Caesar. But Julius Caesar wrote specifically of the Druids again nearly 60 years before the birth of Jesus. So that means if you're talking about at the time that Caesar encountered them, back to when Alexander encountered them, they're right there. You have a span of a good 350 years of the Druids being very, very active throughout most of Middle Europe, and this isn't at all, sort of adjacent to the. I mean, Caesar encountered them in Gaul near France, but not even adjacent to the British Isles. So at this point, the Druids essentially had their foothold all throughout Europe, and eventually, as the Roman Empire expanded, the Druids did end up, or the Celts, I should say, ended up. Retreating by the early years AD, about the first century AD. You did have the Roman Empire had now taken over most of the lands that the Celts had once called their own. So they had taken over Italy, France, Spain, Germany, all of these areas, and were well on their way to invading England at that time. Again, Britain, not yet England. I apologize; it's easy to do that. But at that point, I think it's one of the reasons that the what would become the British Isles became sort of the last haven of the Druids, and the last haven of sort of the great sort of core of the Celtic culture and faith at that time,
Well,
before it would
I,
become absorbed into into Christianity.
well, when we come on to the fact that the Celts were used human sacrifice a lot, that is from the writings of Julius Caesar. And of course, we don't know how much of that was true. He depicted these great figures of these burning men where you would put human beings into and set this figure on fire in effigy. We really don't know how much he saw firsthand or how much he may have been told, because, of course, he was a conqueror over these people, and he probably wanted to make them seem a little bit more
Sort
a
of
little bit
fearsome.
more savage than they actually were, right? But but so that's where we get all this stuff from when we talk about how we perceive the Celts today. It was either from Julius Caesar or from the Victorians. That was because they actually wanted to kind of relive that foundation of their society. But yeah, that's it too.
In the 18th and 19th century, fascination with Druidism did kind of re-explode as people were sort of growing sort of exhausted by the theological stranglehold that Christianity had on European culture for so long, and as sort of that theocratic worldview began to finally loosen its grip, what we call often the Age of Reason, often people would seek out other sort of other spiritual pursuits as well, because people are always fascinated by spirituality, and they may not want to belong to one, but they want to belong to something. And so
Right.
Druidism did kind of rise again, and of course in the 19th century, that ultimately was part and parcel of the rise of spirituality or spiritism, and the whole spiritualist movement. And to this day, we're going to talk a little later about the rise of the modern paganism, including Druidism, which is a big part of the new pagan movement. Well, I say new now, almost more than half a century old, but even still comparatively new on the tick of the clock.
Right. And I think there's something to be said too about the age of the Industrial Revolution. Whenever we were seeing pollution like no other time, we were tearing up all of our woods. So this is romantic as well too, to return to the land itself and become one with nature, just as the Druids were. I think there is a romantic notion in there, and I kind of dig it as well. I kind of dig that vibe as well.
And there was a lot of intellectualism in that pursuit too. I mean, one of my favorite bits of writing by Washington Irving, who of course wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and so much else, one of America's greatest writers. But in the early 19th century, around 1830 or 1840 or so, he was continuing to write, and he wrote some real impassioned pleas about wanting this age of development where the world was growing bigger so quickly and people were becoming so urbanized. He wanted it to end, or to sort of keep its borders intact, because he wanted the old world that he had fallen in love with as a young man to continue to exist. And so he really lamented the modernization of the world. So even intellectuals were sort of turned off by this idea of the sort of boom of industry and the boom of building cities just growing beyond their own borders. So it's not surprising at a time like that the ideas of Druidism and old paganism would hold some appeal for these people.
Yes. And Mary says, didn't they sacrifice slaves and animals when a ruler or important person died? And again, we really don't know, because there was no written accounts left behind. We are only told by other cultures what had happened. I think we can assume that all cultures, most cultures in that area, practice some sort of sacrifice. Either if it was some sort of augury or some sort of portents that were sought, or some way to appease the gods. So I think there was probably some sacrifice going on, but I think a lot of it has been conflated with the Viking involvement within that area as well too.
Because Vikings did, as far as we understand, did often send servants, or concubines, to sort of accompany, great leaders and jarls to the afterlife, as did the Egyptians. Often slaves were sent with a pharaoh or an important noble to the afterlife as well. So it's certainly possible, especially considering how similar in many ways the Celts and the Norse were, that they may have followed similar practices. But as Ron says, it may just be sort of carrying over from that myth from one to the other, because it is very easy sometimes to confuse the cultures of the two.
And we know for a fact that the Romans, during their funerary rites, that they would actually have gladiatorial combats. And this is where the rise of the gladiator came about, because if a person had died, they would for whatever reason, set two people loose on each other so one could kill the other one, which I have no idea how that works out in a culture. So a lot of this might have been a projection of the Roman society upon a very mundane and almost innocent culture like the Celts, and they're being blamed for things that they never did.
That's entirely possible. I think we all have a tendency to look at things through our own lens because we don't really have another frame of reference. Unless you're a well-traveled world anthropologist, it's often difficult to divorce a culture that you've seen from the experience you've had in your own life. And so it's certainly possible that we've projected, and actually not just possible, but almost certain that we have projected some of our own sort of beliefs and expectations onto cultures like the Celts, especially when we become fascinated with a culture, we want to connect to it. And one of the best ways to do that is to associate it with something that we're already familiar with.
Absolutely. And if we fear it, we want to do the exact reverse, right? We want to make them animalistic and everything. And I think that's what has happened with the Celts over successive generations and successive, conquering schemes as well, too, from various cultures.
True. And now the early Celts, one thing that we do understand is that the Celts, like any other culture, evolved over time, and that means that they didn't have one religion that had all of the same practices and all the same features for thousands of years. That they did and evolve over time and developed more complex aspects of their religion. But one thing that we do understand fairly well from reconstructed information, but is that the Celts had a kind of a proto pagan religion that revered two primary god forms, and those god forms are often simply referred to as the mother goddess and the horned god. This is a moon goddess, often represented by three faces. Those faces are today in modern paganism often referred to as the maiden, the mother, and the crone, and they were probably given some similar idea because it represented what they consider the three sacred phases of womanhood. That sort of early bloom, of a young girl, the sacredness of childbearing, and then of course the wisdom of age. So the moon goddess, which ironically, of course, the moon itself changes phases, which is probably why this goddess was associated with the moon, would be the great mother goddess, and then the other god was the sun god, and the sun god, like any other, also had his different sort of aspects. We'll talk about that as their religion evolves later. But it was often the god of nature and the god of earth. He was the sun god, but he was also the god of the wildlife, the god of the fauna, and the god of the hunt. Whereas the moon goddess was often the god of the plants and the vegetation. So they did kind of parcel them into two fairly distinct reigns. So the moon goddess, the sun god, and they each had their domain on earth in an earthly way. And one of the things about a lot of old pagan religions that isn't really common in modern monotheistic religions, like for instance Christianity, is that in Christianity and a lot of big religions like Judaism, Islam, the god lives in the sky and is very divorced from ordinary mundane life. But many of the pagan religions, Norse religions, even Egyptian religions, Celtic religions, had much more mundane gods. The gods themselves, they often saw the gods not merely as deities, but also as ancestors. They often believed that the gods at one time walked the earth themselves and that they were descended from them. So the gods had marriages and births and deaths, and they had battles among one another, and so they tended to see their gods much more like an extension of themselves. And so this great mother and father god and goddess, the triple goddess of the moon and the horned god of the hunt, these were both the most primary aspects of life boiled down into this great eternal mother and father figure who didn't live far away in the sky, but actually lived sort of, in an earthly plane. And so this was their proto religion before they would end up sort of developing a much wider pantheon.
Whenever you think of a hunter-gatherer culture, this encapsulates that belief system, that way of life completely.
It does. Now, I was mentioning a little while ago that I was going to address the idea that there is a fair amount of similarity, at least superficial similarity, between the Vikings and the Celts. And it is difficult to look at either of these cultures and not see the similarities in terms of the way we tend to portray them in media. It makes that even more similar because we tend to, in shows like Vikings or things like that, we tend to dress them and give them decor and sort of elaborate designs, which have a lot in common. But it's not entirely false. The truth is that the Viking, Norse, and the Celts probably had a common ancestor, although quite a ways back. I mean, it would have been in the distant past, but it does mean that the gods, the traditions, and the cultures themselves do have a great deal of similarity. In fact, far too similar to really be considered a coincidence. And when you look at the Nordic lands, when you look at Scandinavia, you've got Denmark and Finland and even Iceland. It's not that long of a distance to the British lands. In fact, the very first places that the Vikings went raiding after they sort of started going to the west was to the British Isles. And so cross communication and cross culture between these this would have been, now we're looking at about the 9th or 10th century at that point, but before that, they almost certainly came from a common Indo-European ancestor and carried those cultures. They had time to evolve and become quite different, but you see the commonality between these two. So it's not uncommon to see them as two sides of the same, fairly distantly related coin.
Right. And we also have to consider that, the Vikings did take over Ireland. Dublin is actually a Viking, a Scandinavian word, and it has no Celtic bearing whatsoever. So I think we have a lot of those ideas being cross-pollinated with the Celtic cultures are there, and not only cross-pollinated in ideas and in traditions, but also the way people look at these people. They look at them as one and the same. They did not differentiate between them.
No, I think you're right. And it's one of the reasons that I think that the cultures ended up meshing as well as they did. While the Vikings arrived as conquerors and as raiders, they eventually settled, in many places. And much of the sort of Celtic world, the modern, Celtic world, again, Ireland, Scotland, and even into England, has so much Viking blood. There's Viking names, Viking places, and everything still to this day, because the people meshed much better than they would have otherwise. I think if the cultures were much more radically different, even their sort of physical appearance was really quite similar.
Right, and the Vikings lived in Ireland hundreds of years, so it wasn't like it was an overnight thing. And it wasn't until after the year 1000 that the great Irish king Brian Boru finally kicked them out of Ireland once and for all. So we have a period of the Vikings being there for about 300 or 400 years.
And no matter how long they stayed there, they always stayed a little bit on the rowdy side. So it's not surprised they ended up getting kicked out of Ireland and England, although they eventually came back as the Vikings always always wanted to do. But so the great mother goddess and the sort of great father god of the sort of very, very early sort of Celtic belief, and is something that is fairly revered again in modern paganism to this day, eventually started to branch out. And just like in other cultures, including the Roman culture, Viking culture, Greek culture, etc., the gods began to be sort of parceled out into different sort of having different jobs. The mother goddess was not simply a mother goddess, but there were little sub goddesses, there were sub gods, and each of them had their own domains and their own stories. And as I said, these were gods that existed in the minds of the Celts as a fairly human way, in a fairly human way. They had mothers and fathers, they had brothers and sisters, and they lived very human-like lives, despite the fact that they were considered divine. But the great goddess ultimately became a figure that is still to this day considered the sort of the mother goddess, the sort of progenitor of all of the Celtic gods, and that would be Danu. Now, Danu is an interesting character from folklore perspective, because with the almost absence of writing in Old Celtic, we don't have her presence in a lot of mythology. Mythology doesn't really give a lot of details. She's a very primal figure, and really the only thing we do know about the figure of Danu is that she is meant to have not only given birth to all of the other gods, and suckled them at her own breasts, which is a big part of it, but also in many ways also becomes the consort to the great father god. She would give birth to him and then become his consort as well. And before anybody gets kind of skeeved out by the idea of incest, we're talking about divine beings here, and those rules don't really apply. So just as you have in Christianity, you have the idea that God gives birth, sort of impregnates a woman, gives birth to Jesus, but that Jesus is himself God. You have this kind of insular sort of Ouroboros idea of the two concepts, which are both separate and together simultaneously. And when you're talking about divine power and magic, you can't expect the logic of sort of a linear timeline with that. So So Danu would go on to give birth to the entire Celtic pantheon, who are often referred to specifically as the Tuatha De Danann, which means literally the people or the children of Danu. And so her children became the entire Celtic pantheon. And this pantheon will sound a little familiar to you as we go through it. We're going to talk about not every one of the gods. The Viking, or rather the Celts, had over 400 gods and demigods, each of them again having their own little sort of domain, in daily life. But some of the major ones are certainly worth exploring, including the father god that we were referring to earlier, and that father god would be Dagda. Dagda is often, I think, maybe because monotheistic religion had such a strong impact, often portrayed as the true leader of the gods, not Danu, who was the first, but rather Dagda, the father. And that's probably because of our sort of patriarchal view on the world. I think that tends to bleed over into our perception. But Dagda, the father of the Celtic gods, was also the great Druid. He was the first Druid. He was the great keeper of wisdom. Makes him sound quite a bit like Odin, the all-father of the Viking people. And he is, as I say, both born of and consort to the great mother goddess Danu. So here we still have the mother god and the father god, but the goddess, or I'm sorry, the other way around, pardon me, mother goddess and the father god. But now they've sort of taken on a more specific personality, no longer just these primal core concepts, but ones that actually have personality and would go on to give birth, and become the sort of progenitors of the rest of the gods.
Yes. I've written several times on this particular subject, and I think one of the great shames that happened within humanity is when we actually put gods and goddesses in our own image. The idea that we wanted to, kind of control how we approach the divine and take them out of nature and then make them into us. That was, I think, one of the great injustices ever portrayed upon on the idea of the divine.
But it's interesting because so many cultures across the world have something that we call ancestor worship, where even the cultures that don't have gods per se revere their ancestors instead of gods, or in a godlike way. And in many ways, I think that we see that reflected here, because rather than them believing that the gods are completely separate from them, as again we do see in many monotheistic religions, we instead have this idea of the gods being direct ancestors, and even having mortal children who walk the earth. And of course, you do see that to some extent in monotheistic religion. In Judaic and Christian religion, we have God sort of forming Adam and Eve. So technically, those would be his first children. But that's still a more divine process. Whereas the Celts, the Greeks, and everything all believe that the gods literally, mated with one another and gave birth to children in a fairly traditional way. So I think it's attempting to connect with your God so that they don't feel so distant. And that ancestor worship is pretty widespread. So it may be an injustice to the gods themselves, but I think that it was a way for humanity to feel connected to their own deities instead of feeling sort of left behind on the planet by gods who never show themselves.
Yeah, although that could be a remnant of the ancestor worship in our collective folk memory, that these gods and goddesses may have at one point been true people.
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, and again, I mean, in the absolute beginning of time, we all started from one point, and so we carry all of that with us. And so I think you see echoes of that in one form or another in virtually every faith. So some of the most notable gods from the pantheon would be, of course, every pantheon has to have a god of death and destruction, and this would be in the Celtic world the Morrigan. Now, the Morrigan isn't evil, although often death gods are portrayed in a sort of an evil way, but she was the goddess of both death and the battlefield, and the Morrigan would guard the way to the underworld, and her ravens would fly out to collect the souls of the dead, or she herself in the form of a raven would do that. So again, this is interesting because I think that she does bear a great deal of similarity to the concept of the Valkyrie, who are also the sort of goddesses, these multi-goddesses of death, but you have this winged bird-like figure who is the keeper of the underworld. So she's kind of a combination in a lot of ways of the Viking or Norse concept of Hel or Hela, the queen of the underworld, and the Valkyries themselves, who would carry the souls to Valhalla. So I'm not trying to suggest, as I say, that these are the same religion, but there are remarkable parallels between them.
Yeah. Also, look at the ravens as well too, which was a very important element in Nordic cultures as well too. They were the communicators with the gods, the kind of the conduits back and forth. And just to kind of stir the pot here a little bit, I also see a little bit of Lilith in the Morgan.
Oh, absolutely. Well, again, and you have bleed over, cross-cultural bleed over from so many of these cultures as well. And because so much of this for us is reconstructed and was not written down by them, it's often hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. I think when we don't have the answer, we fill in the cracks with things that were more modern. And so it is possible that these are different perspectives on these deities than the Celts themselves had, but they're the best that we have been able to reconstruct of the way they view these beings. Another one who's always been a great favorite of mine is the sun god Lu or Lug, god of the sun and the forge. He was renowned for his strong spear arm, and again, basically walked the earth and was able to help the Keltoi, or the Celtic people, defeat the evil Fomori, one of the great enemies of the Celtic people, or specifically of the Tuatha De Danann, who, as I say, have conflicts and battles with one another, so lived fairly mortal-like lives. And in fact, gods could be wounded, and we're going to talk about that later as well. But Lu gives his name to the harvest festival Lunasa, which is at the beginning of August. It's sort of the 1st of August every year, which is one of the great harvest festivals still celebrated in many modern neo-pagan traditions. And it's sort of this Apollo-like god, now talking about quite a different transition here, but a very Apollonian or Apollo-like god of the sun. And another, similar in some ways, another hero god was Nuada Silverhand. Now, Nuada Silverhand was a god king, so he not only was he of divine origin, but also served as a king here in the mortal world, but lost his arm in a battle with the Firbolg tribe. And Nuada, in the tradition of the Tuatha De Danann, a king had to be perfect. A king had to be fully intact in order to serve. And so he was actually dethroned, having lost his arm, until he was given a mystically created silver arm to replace the arm that he lost, and was therefore able to reclaim his throne, and eventually magically had his own living arm restored. But again, you have this living heroic god king who is a direct descendant of the gods themselves.
Very interesting.
Now, here's a one that some of you might be familiar with for a variety of reasons, from both a pagan and a Christian perspective, and this is one that we celebrated quite recently, because at the beginning of February you have what the pagans call Imbolc, which is another great sort of seasonal festival, and that is the time of Breed. Breed, we spell it as Bridget, but Breed, one of the most beloved of Celtic deities. She was the goddess of fire and rebirth, and honored in the late winter feast of Imbolc to welcome the coming spring, because at that time of the year, it was in early February that lambs first began to be born, and the first milk basically was generating in the livestock, and this is how people often knew that spring was just around the corner. So Breed, this fire goddess, so with her fiery red hair, was one of the most beloved gods. But because Breed was so beloved of the Celtic people, as Christianity spread across the Celtic lands, they simply refused to give her up. And so, not knowing what else to do, the Catholic Church adopted her, and she became Saint Breed, or Saint Bridget, again, still so beloved. So the Christian Church couldn't stop the people from celebrating her, and they canonized her and made her a saint. But most of her basic domain or principles are really quite the same. So to this day, a lot of Catholic people consider Saint Breed one of the great patron saints of Ireland.
I actually have a St. Bridget's cross in my kitchen, because according to tradition, if you put the cross up, it will keep your house safe from fire.
Well, that's actually, again, as a fire goddess, it seems like you couldn't pick a better protector for that.
That's absolutely the case.
Now, Breed and Nuada of the Silver Hand are more like demigods. They're of divine origin, but basically have a mortal form. Another one of the great heroes of the Celtic mythology and of the Celtic world is, and I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, but it's Cuchulainn. He was a demigod. He was the son of the great sun god Lu, and he was often referred to as the Hound of Ulster. Now, the reason he was called this was supposedly he had actually slain the guard dog of an enemy, and then feeling bad for having slain the dog, agreed that he would actually take the place of the guard dog and serve as a guard dog for this warlord until he could find another replacement, which is a little bit of a curious story. But interestingly enough, in addition to being called the Hound of Ulster for that reason, he was also supposedly called that due to his terrifying battle rage. Again, much very, very similar to the Viking berserker rage, and something you do see in the Celtic tribes. His battle rage, in which he literally was supposed to physically transform into a deformed, monstrous, beast-like creature nearly twice his size. He was one of the greatest warriors in all of Celtic mythology, until, of course, he was finally slain in battle, just proving that these gods and demigods still had a mortal element to them. And so, again, not entirely divine, but of divine origin, but able to be related to by the common people.
Mm-hmm.
So, as the Christians sort of rolled across the Celtic lands, as you can see, just as they had done with Saint Brede and turned her into a saint, some of these figures simply couldn't be sort of burned out of the people, and so they were demoted in a way. And so many of the great spirits or great divinities of Irish lore ended up being downgraded to spirits and goblins and trolls and things like that. When we see creatures like the banshee or the leprechaun or the sprites and the brownies, these are sort of the diminutive versions of the old Celtic gods. And in fact, in a lot of modern Irish mythology, they talk about the fair folk or the fairy people, and you have, Titania and Oberon, the king and the queen of the fairies, who are basically, again, these demoted versions of the goddess and god figures, and often portrayed as not necessarily evil, but mischievous and troublesome to humanity. So here you have the Christians allowing them to keep their mythology, but making sure that they don't consider these to be, figures of goodness or figures of benevolence, but figures who were, even if they weren't entirely evil, were certainly dangerous, and humans should, if possible, have no traffic with them.
Right. Yeah, they at one point were fallen angels. At the other times, they were considered to be the souls of unbaptized children. But at the end of the day, they were all warnings to kind of mind your P's and Q's, get baptized, and go to church.
Exactly. Now, some of the gods were very, very tenacious. Some of the gods were so sort of baked into the Celtic people that they had a hard time getting rid of them. And so gods like Cernunnos, the horned one, sort of the great horned god of old, survived in a lot of different forms. And these primal gods, effectively, though diminished in power, still had a part in Celtic daily life, and were often revered or even seen. When a person saw the image of the sort of Christ with his crown of thorns, it wasn't so removed, especially with the primitive, designs that were often used on Celtic iconography. They weren't so far removed from the horned god, and they could sort of see this ancient horned god in the figure of Christ, and that is something that the Christian church did not approve of whatsoever. And so, if a god could not be either demoted far enough to become insignificant or simply stripped from the Celtic, sort of worldview, what they would do is they would demonize the figure. And so the figure of this horned father god is one of the most well known in Christian mythology, because in a sort of Christian, legend, this would be the figure that we now see as the horned, hooved Satan. And one of the reasons that you can tell that this is actually descended from the horned god is that prior to the period at which the Christian church was beginning to overrun Europe, the depictions of Satan were always more reptilian. You had these reptilian scaled figures with the beaks and the bat wings and things like that. And a much more, we actually in our dragon episode talked about the demonic aspects of the worm or the sort of satanic beast there. But it wasn't until they began to roll across Europe that this horned goat god version of Satan began to take place, because this, of course, echoed the Roman and Greek Pan and Bacchus and the Cernunnos and the different horned god figures that were quite popular. They were often gods of fertility and the forest within the Celtic world. And so, unfortunately, we've turned Pan and all these wonderful gods into the little devils and demons that sort of plague the Christian mind.
And then their fertility symbols now become warnings of lascivious behavior and orgies and all those other kind of things that happen in the woods.
Very much so. So, Despite all of this, the truth is that nobody has ever successfully stamped out these pagan ideas, and so, like nature itself, the old Celtic gods and spirits refuse to die altogether, and they do eternally reincarnate in for new generations and in new forms. And in fact, in the mid 20th century, there were some pioneers of the new paganism. At that point, people like now there are quite a few of them. This is only a small sampling, but Gerald Gardner, Sybil Leek, Doreen Valiente, and Janet and Stuart Farrer, all during the mid and later 20th century, sort of broke the stereotype of paganism and introduced modern witchcraft, which was often referred to as Wicca, which is almost entirely based on old Celtic reconstructed beliefs, and reintroduced paganism to a much more modern sort of worldview. It is true, as we were talking about earlier, that this Druidic belief did raise its head in the 19th century as well, but never really caught on. And so modern paganism, as we know it today, which is an incredibly widespread sort of a spectrum of religions and faiths that's common all over the world today, largely burst into existence in the early to mid 20th century as a result of some of these pioneers. And there were others as well. There were Alexanders, who created the Alexandrian tradition. Gardner created the Gardnerian tradition. All of them basically founded these religious ideas, or these new pagan religions based on their own reconstructions, and they are in many ways still going strong today. And in fact, in Britain to this day, as a matter of fact, it would have happened just maybe 15 or 20 hours ago. The Druids of modern Britain still gather at standing stones and other sites like Stonehenge and observe the solstices and the equinoxes. And Celtic paganism continues to have a great hold on modern people who are looking for a connection to the older ways, as we were saying, that something that people often sort of desire to have is this connection to the old world and the old ways of paganism. And so to this day, it is growing strong and remains a fairly popular and ever growing spiritual path for people.
And it's understandable as well too, because you don't need any intermediary. You have direct contact with what you consider the divine.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a sort of again, it's not one faith by any means. There are many different versions of paganism all over the world at this point, but it does tend to rely more on your sense of self and your sense of connection to the divine, and even concepts of sin are based on personal ethics. Now, there's always obviously a perception of good and evil within any culture, but there isn't really the concept of sin or even hell to speak of. So it's often a much less aggressive religion, and many people have found that it's an alternative to the more dogmatic religions that are common in monotheism, again, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, and things like that. So, well, ladies and gentlemen, we have overstepped our hour just a wee bit. It's 10:03 right now, and as always, hope you guys had a good time and enjoyed some of this info tonight. Ron, once again, happy solstice, or rather equinox birthday for you.
Thank you very much.
Enjoy being the harbinger of spring for us. Next week, we're planning on coming back with a very fun one of our regular viewers, John, I think, suggested a Faustian show, and so we're going to talk about a much darker topic, which is deals with the devil. So that's going to be our topic for next week, and we very much hope that you guys will join us in 1 week for the next episode of Mysteries, Myths, and Monsters. And I hope that you guys have a wonderful start to your spring as well. So good night from us, and Ron, have a wonderful evening.
Thank you very much, guys. Thank you.